Well, thanks so much for joining us. I'm super excited for us to have this conversation about the intersection of accessibility and disability rights and transit in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the ADA. So I know we know each other from Move Minnesota board events, but as you know, I'm the community organizer on the team. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I do a lot of work in the advocacy sphere of our work, showing up at the Capitol and getting folks plugged into the initiatives we're moving forward to advance mobility here in the Twin Cities and across our state. And can you remind me what, I know you're involved in at MnDOT, like what different buckets of work are you working on right now?
Yeah, so my role at MnDOT is I work within the Office of Equity and Diversity, and I am the ADA coordinator for Title I, and Title I is all employment-related reasonable accommodations. So I help employees when they discover that they have illness or a disability or a medical condition that is interfering with their ability to do their job. And they oftentimes think that they're going to come to me and learn that they can't do their job anymore and they're going to lose their job. And I get to work with them and figure out, brainstorm, problem solve, and figure out innovative ways for them to continue to be able to do their work through a reasonable accommodation. So I absolutely love the work I do. I get to do it all day long, every day, and it's never the same. It's always different, and I just love that work.
So framing up our conversation, 1 in 5 of Metro Transit riders identify as a person with disabilities, with a disability. It's clear that our fight for equitable transportation and mobility justice needs to include people of all abilities. I know this is something I really care about. Growing up, I grew up with a single mom. My mom is a person with a disability, and we did not have a car, and she was also not able to drive. So I, as a child, navigating the world and accessing all the things we needed, I got a very intimate view in how both resourceful she was in accessing transportation and taking care of us, but also a lot of the barriers that were in place, from just the length of time for metro mobility and medical cabs, and just really struggling with 2 kiddos on the bus trying to get groceries home. So it's something I feel really passionate and I care about. And also as an advocate in the transit world, I notice it's something that often falls to the wayside when we're having conversations about the transit system that we're looking to build, or conversations about like bike lanes and scooters. It is definitely can be I feel, and from my perspective, I feel it can be like marginalized in that conversation. So that's why I'm here, and I really care about this work. So, and thanks so much for joining me, Ken. Yeah, and our first question is, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago, promising inclusive systems and infrastructure that work for people of all abilities. How has that goal been important to you, both personally and professionally?
I was not born with a disability. I acquired my sight impairment. I'm blind, totally blind. I have no light perception. My eyes just don't work. In my mid-30s, I discovered I had a rare retinal eye disease. And besides that shock, the other shock was that there was no treatment for that particular disease. And there was no way to slow it, stop it. About 6 years into my medical career, I learned of my eye disease, and a year later was blind. So at that point, you know, previous to that, I'm almost ashamed to say I probably had no idea and would have had no idea about this whole concept of disability and accessibility and the Americans with Disabilities Act it didn't have much meaning in my life at that time. After I lost my sight and tried to pick up the pieces later to figure out what the heck I was going to do, I discovered this whole world of this different ability world, of all kinds of people with all kinds of disabilities that seem to manage to pick up their life and continue. And at the time, that gave me some motivation to move forward. I mean, I literally was scared still. I never left my house after I lost my sight. I was afraid to go outside. I didn't want to go with anybody because I thought I would be that extra burden on somebody. And there were many examples of people taking me out and I'm holding onto their arm and they run me into door jams because they're not used to having somebody on their arm. And, you know, all of that stuff led to me just deciding I just needed to be with myself for a while. That gave me a lot of time to think. And once I learned that I could learn how to live in my new world, went to vocational rehabilitation programming school. I call it blind school, learned how to be a blind person, learned how to cook, learned how to use the public transportation, which I had never used before, never. I'm almost embarrassed to say that. But as a young, healthy person, there was no need to rely on public transportation. I lived from my car, as many, many people do. So that was my awareness at the time. So through my disability, I learned a whole different awareness. And the beauty of it is that we can be independent. We have the ability to get where we need to go using public transportation. It was just a whole new thing that I had to learn, but it was there. Infrastructure was in place, basically. And learning how to master that gave me a new sense of independence. So, you know, the other thing I just want to add is people with disabilities are experts at problem solving. Not because we have a gene that gives us extra ability to problem solve, but because of moving around in a world that wasn't designed for us with our disabilities, we have to constantly recreate how we do things. If I can't access a transit platform in one direction, I can't look around and see another way. I've got to figure it out. So that constant practice of doing something differently to get my needs met really creates this problem-solving ability that's not foreign to me. And that really has been a positive force in my life as I've continued to exist kind of in both worlds now. Because of my long time of living as a person, sighted and able-bodied, and now living in that complete different world, I have perspectives of both of those environments. And I think that really gives me ability to see things a little differently, provide advice and suggestions in helping our system be better accessible to everybody. So.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, that was, I really liked how you talked about just so eloquently about like the resilience factor with developing those problem solving skills. And it's just, yeah, it was just such a beautiful way you phrased that. I really appreciated that. So we have our second question here, which is, in your experience, what has changed since the Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed? Is transportation more accessible today?
Absolutely. Are we where we completely need to be? No way. But I can remember when I first moved here to Minnesota, fully alive. My eyes worked, I drove, I drove everywhere until I was now faced with this ability of needing to learn how to use the system. I remember, if you can imagine, losing your sight, learning how to walk on the sidewalk so that you could walk in a fairly straight line and not end up in someone's yard, and learning to cross streets. Seems like an undaunting task, but you start off in really quiet areas and gain confidence, and then slowly go to more complex intersections and just keep building onto your education. And I guess my point is that at some point we started riding the bus, and what an exhilarating experience that was to be able to know that I could board a bus and go somewhere eventually on my own and get somewhere that I wanted to go. And at the end of my training, my instructor would give me an address on a piece of, on a note paper, and he would read it to me, and I'd put it in my device that would speak to me. And I had to meet him at that address in an hour. And that address was somewhere across town. I had no idea which bus got there, how to get there, how many transfers I would need. So I had to learn how to research, call the bus information line, learn what routes I needed to take and the directions I needed to go, commit that to memory or put it in my device that read to me. And off I went, and an hour later I would meet my instructor at that location. That was the true test that you were independent. You could take the bus, and I could really get anywhere I needed to go on a bus. Might take several transfers sometimes, but I could get there. And learning that was really important to me for all the obvious reasons. But again, coming from a person who had no experience with public transportation to all of a sudden relying on public transportation for my independence gave me an appreciation, I think, that few people have. Yeah. But today, like I said, we have some ways to go, but our transportation system is generally accessible and getting better all the time. I think one of the really critical pieces in that is people with disabilities are now on advisory committees to help make sure that individuals' needs within the disability community are spoken, identified, so they can be addressed. So people collectively can come together and try and address that. And I think we're at a point now where many people with all kinds of disabilities have come forward to share their experience to try to make our system a better system. We're getting there slowly.
Definitely. And yeah, and I think just similar to so many issues, when we're in the fight for equity, it's that seat at the table is so invaluable, and not just invaluable, but essential to meaningful and real progress moving forward, because you can't do it without it. Obviously, like we talked about, like we've come leagues and leagues from where we were, but more progress is still needed. What barriers are still making it hard and at times impossible for folks with living with disabilities to access or to get to where they need to go? And how is that impacting folks?
Yeah, so part of the barriers that exist are part of the way our transit system just does business. We have a transit system, I think, that comes first, and then everyone else, citizens with and without disabilities, have to figure out how they plan their life around our transit system. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's the transit system that comes first. And that's a huge barrier. Not everyone can change the way they do things based around making it fit in a pre-existing system. I do a lot of work in the St. Cloud area, because we have another district office in St. Cloud. And in order for me to get to places that I need to go to have meetings with employees, I have to travel. Well, I can't just jump in a state car or drive myself somewhere. I have to rely on other forms of public transportation to do my job. I thought, well, I'll just take one of those trains back up going the other way, because people always come to the Twin Cities in the morning, and I'll just take it one of those back and have somebody pick me up closer to my meeting location. Oh, I learned that at that time, there was no ability to ride back. They only had one-way commutes. So people from the Big Lake area could commute down to the Twin Cities in the morning and then commute back in the afternoon. But there was no ability to ride one of those empty trains that was going back to pick up more people to bring them to the Twin Cities, which just didn't make sense to me. So why couldn't somebody ride on that train that was going back to the Big Lake area anyway and get off where they needed to go? But that just wasn't the way it was done at the time. Today we have both direction routes, but we didn't in the beginning. And that's what I mean by our system oftentimes creates a system or a timetable that works for the system and doesn't really address the needs of people all the time. I think COVID is an interesting phenomena with our transit system that is allowing us the ability to rethink our transit. And some of this, I understand, is part of the discussion now to figure out how can our transit system be reimagined to be more receptive and respectful of people's needs, as opposed to let's create this infrastructure and let everybody else figure out how to work with it. It's creating us some new opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're totally spot on about how the rigidity of the system can leave a lot of people who don't, for whatever reason, have a lot of personal flexibility. Like we don't, like you were saying with the commute, we don't live. My work schedule doesn't necessarily coordinate with when the last bus of a particular route ends, and like how does that bar me or someone else from employment, or when schedules are buses are delayed when you go to Sunday hours or holiday hours, like hours and hours, and the time penalty for people without that flexibility that they experience. And it's a real challenge, because it's our system needs to serve many people, but how can we at the same time run this macro system while making sure that we're serving people with dignified routes and commutes that work for them?
Yeah.